Good morning and welcome to the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce's Mid-Year Economic and Political Outlook. I am John Welch, Executive Director of the Brazilian American Chamber. First and foremost, on behalf of the Chamber, we wish you and your families health and safety in this difficult time. We thank you for joining us, and thank you also goes to Banco Bradesco for sponsoring the event. Brazil faces an uncertain outlook marked by the COVID crisis and structural needs that predate the pandemic. Questions abound about current and future fiscal policy, monetary policy, growth, and whether the government and Congress will push ahead on reforms. Our distinguished panel today will help clarify the current context and outline possible answers. Our moderator today is my colleague and friend, Paulo Vieira da Cunha of Verbank Consulting. Paulo has held various positions on Wall Street. He was Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Brazil from 2008 to 2011, held various positions at the World Bank, the IMF, and earlier in his career in government, research institutes, and universities in Brazil. He is a director of the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce and holds a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. You can find Paulo's full bio and those of all the panelists on the link on the reminder that was sent yesterday and on the BACC website. Before turning the screen over to Paulo, I would ask you to please use the Q&A tab for questions. You can make them at any time, and we will look to answer them after the panel discussion is over during the Q&A period. Thank you very much. Without further ado, I will turn the screen over to Paulo. Paulo?
Thank you, John, and good morning to all. I would like to start with a picture, and let me see if I can share the screen. I mean, what you're seeing here is real GDP growth in Brazil, observed until 2019, and the range of likely forecasts to 2030. The dark line is the 10-year moving average. Note that in the range of most likely outcomes, the 10-year average this year would be 0. In other words, looking back as a whole, the economy stagnated. On a per capita basis, welfare as captured by GDP declined. And this is not a tale where after dark times, the hero comes out triumphant with rewards. In this case, there are no dividends, but even additional costs. To be sure, it could have been worse. The fiscal and monetary measures taken this year helped avoid an even bigger disaster, especially among the poor. Brazil is one of the few middle-income countries with extensive networks for public health, education, and family welfare. The instruments in place could be activated and expanded. Even so, the measures protected income more than employment. And given the lack of fiscal space, most analysts presume that in 2021, income support will diminish. Many questions follow. For example, will employment recover enough to sustain consumption? If not, will exports and investment pick up the slack? Even if investment comes first from a rebuilding of inventories, would it fuel improved confidence? Is this return of confidence conditioned on progress with structural reforms? And is the tax reform just sent to Congress sufficient to give renewed impetus on the reforms? To what extent does confidence depend more on the political outlook? And how will macroeconomic management proceed? How will the government adhere to the budget ceiling, given spending pressures on an administration that has problems in Congress? These are some of the questions that cast doubt on the Brazilian recovery. They don't have easy answers. And that's why we are very fortunate today to have with us a group of truly amazing thinkers and policy analysts to help us go through these issues, exploring possible scenarios. We start with a macro analysis We then turn to a view of the markets, followed by an evaluation of the more structural challenges for the country rating. And last but not least, we turn to the political situation. I want to thank the speakers very much. And let me point out that Zeina Latif will be joining. Oh, she's just joining us. Welcome, Zeina, and thank you very much for being with us. You have all of their bios, and let's start. We start with Fernando Norato Barbosa from Bradesco. Fernando, por favor.
Perfect. So, Paulo, thank you very much. Thank you all, my colleagues here, Zeina, Drauzio, Lisa, and Thiago. It's a very interesting moment to talk about Brazil. So I'll be very, very short here, keep it to 7, 8 minutes at most, and try to outline my most important competitive advantages, mostly in growth. But I would like to make a couple of comments also about politics and how we see the challenges moving forward. So first of all, I will start by saying that economic data is surprising us a lot on the upside during the last 2 months and the beginning of the third quarter. We just upgraded our GDP forecast for the year from -5.9 to -4.5. And this is a result not only of the publicly available data, but also our own proprietary surveys. And this shows us that the current reopening of the economy is being relatively, I would like to highlight that, successful. In which extent I say relatively successful? To the extent that the health system in Brazil did not go into a collapse. So Paulo just mentioned a little bit about our social network protection. And this is one important aspect of Brazil, despite the bad headlines, and most of these headlines are in the right direction, but I would say that the Brazilian health system is being able to tackle the issue of COVID without collapsing. And this is allowing the economy to gradually reopen. With that reopening in mind, so the economy is picking up quite quickly. We just had the release 10 minutes ago of a formal job creation in Brazil. In fact, it was a destruction of 11,000 jobs in June, but that was much better than any other expectations. So we see a very important pickup in growth in the third quarter. We assume that probably markets will be surprised on the upside with short-term growth. Obviously, this is also related to our low capacity of forecasting with our models, what happened during the pandemic. This was the typical break in our series, but I believe markets will get surprised on the upside with economic growth in Brazil. Well, on top of that, I would say that economic policy is still very supportive in Brazil, and I would like to talk also about fiscal and monetary policy. On the fiscal front, we estimate that government transfers, they were responsible for a huge increase in total wages in Brazil, total payrolls in Brazil. So they compensated income, as Paulo was saying, much more than jobs, but total income grew much more than anticipated because of the government transfer. Obviously, there is a legacy from that, and that aims to the challenge of the medium term related to the public debt. But our calculations show that during the second and third quarter, all the government transfers plus some anticipations of future benefits, individuals would have access only by the end of the year. So total income has grown by more than 10% in the second and third quarter when compared to the same period last year. So this is supporting consumption, but something that was not expected is also happening in Brazil. It's quite clear in the US, and you have very good data on that, but we don't have good data on Brazil, but it's clearly happening. So the level of savings rate of families is rising. We see that clearly from banking deposits, for example. So all these government transfers helped to cushion the drop in consumption, but because people are facing social distancing and they cannot consume, part of the consumption that was left behind is accumulated in savings. And we believe that these savings will help smooth consumption in the fourth quarter of the year when the government transfers will be removed. So this is the first story. The second is about monetary policy. When I look at monetary policy, just controlling my time here. When I look at monetary policy, there's a lot of room for the central bank to keep rates very stimulative. So we look at inflation at very low levels. We believe that they will start hiking rates only by the end of next year. So it allows them to keep supporting growth with these low rates, and credit is beginning to flow, not only for companies, but also for individuals. So all this creates a backdrop that helps economic growth. This is the first part of the story. The other stories, and my colleagues will address with much more detail than I do, but I would like to highlight two final aspects. One is about the political environment, and Thiago will have a lot to say. And I'm trying to be very pragmatic here. So I believe that since, let's say, 30 or 40 days ago, we started to see a more operational coalition working in Brazil. And why is this important in our macro view? Because we were very concerned about what would be the post-pandemic economic agenda. And what we are seeing is that at least some agenda related to reforms, including tax reform, central bank independence, maybe some public sector administrative reform will be on the agenda. So these reforms, they are still being discussed, and that's very important to keep some perspective of growth in Brazil moving forward. So we also upgraded our view of how the government is managing its own coalition. Although you might discuss whether it comes from Congress itself, from the central government, but all in all, it's much more operational today than it was 3 or 4 months ago. In our view, I would love to hear Thiago's and other participants' view. And that leads me to the final part. So I would say we are constructive short term. We see a typical V-shaped recovery in the quarterly GDP data. We see that the political environment will not produce much volatility at the very short term, but we are truly concerned about medium term. When I look a little bit beyond, and that's Paulo's provocation, 2021 is a critical year in our view because of a couple of things. First, the spending cap bill, or the ceiling bill, it's very difficult to reach the target. So we need further government spending cuts to achieve the target. And this is critical. And we see a lot of debate in Brazil about bringing down the legislation that anchors the spending cap bill. And this is very important in our view. We don't like that type of discussion. And we finally think that we think that by August, September this year, the level of uncertainty will probably rise on this front because of the budget that is needed to be formatted for 2021 by August, September this year. So this is one of our concerns. The second one about 2021 is, okay, there will be no support from the government, but I still believe monetary policy will be supportive. But if we don't start creating a positive environment in terms of reforms, it's difficult to see private investment recovery, and there's absolutely no room for public investment to grow in Brazil. So we desperately need to see the government moving very quickly in the reformist agenda and on privatization. And I think this is a big unknown, a big question that we have. And finally, and I'll stop here, by 2021, all the model, let's say, growth model, or the policy model will be a discussion at the verge of the election by 2022. So if for any reason the economy is not growing well, if for any reason we are still discussing reforms, we are not advancing in reforms, I fear that by 2021, people will be discussing whether our model is working or not. Even the current government could be discussing that. And that brings a scenario that creates me a little bit of anxious about 2022 election. All in all, I believe the best case scenario happens, and that's our baseline scenario. Reforms will be put on track. The spending cap bill will be maintained, and we see a year of growth by 2021, 3.5%. That prevents Brazil from entering 2022, the election year, in a very weak and fragile position. So, Paulo, I'll stop here with my 10 minutes. So my other colleagues can comment on that. So thank you very much for this initial moment.
Thank you, Fernando. Thank you very much. That was an excellent introduction, and gladly one that's a little bit more upbeat about at least what could happen in the short term. I'm really delighted that we have Zeina Latif with us, and I would like to now pass the word to her. Zeina, please.
First of all, sorry for my delay. Paul and John, thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be in this panel with so distinguished colleagues here. Fernando mentioned that he is more concerned about medium term in Brazil. Of course, I share this view. Let me explore some points here. First, we need to remember that in this very short run, we have kind of an artificial stimuli in the economy, which has to do with the emergency aid, that 600 reais per month for each individual, or the poorest individuals, informals basically. And the total amount per month of this public policy is, we're talking about 50 billion per month, 50 billion reais. This value exceeds a lot what is produced by the poorest half of the population, which is 30 billion. So what we are saying is that we have a public policy that is injecting resources in the economy artificially, and it's a powerful instrument for stimulating demand. And we are seeing the result of that in the economic indicators with this kind of fast recovery. Looks like a V-shaped, but it's a transitory instrument. It's impossible to keep that. The government, of course, they postponed the end of the program, but we know that it's impossible to keep this program for further months and for next year. So of course, we will have the consequences of that in the aggregate demand. Another thing is that we had, I think government was successful in terms of protecting formal jobs. When we compare the unemployment rate in Brazil to peer countries, other countries in Latin America, we see that unemployment rate is kind of low compared to these countries. But we know that, again, it's a result of public policies that are, again, powerful, but transitory. So we know that in terms, even about the, we talk about the recovery. So it looks like V-shaped recovery, but it's not exactly a V-shaped recovery. It's a relief in the short run, but I don't see this trend for the whole second half of the year, and of course for next year. So my biggest concern actually is for the next year. We see market consensus with a 3.5% growth for next year, but I think we should expect something closer to 2% actually. I think 3.5 is not feasible. And there is, of course, the fiscal risks. Unfortunately, the debate in Brazil regarding the need of preserving the spending cap and resuming reforms, it's not mature. We see divisions even among economists. So we have important economists that are defending the end of the spending cap, and it's not neutral for the Congress. So I think that we have a division in the government, inside the government. We see, for example, chief of staff and other ministers that they want to flexibilize the spending cap. They don't have the same intention to move on with the structural reforms or fiscal reforms. I don't see this, I don't see a reformist government in this sense. I see, of course, the ambition of Paulo Guedes, the economy minister, but I don't see the same view among other ministers or even the president. And so what I think is that we have the risk of some flexibilization of the spending cap, which is bad news for the central bank. We have, I think it opens a danger precedent in Brazil. I think this is really concerning. And regarding the reforms, although this big crisis, ironically, could stimulate, some pragmatism, I don't think that it's going to be, for now. I don't see important reforms being approved, not only because we have elections this year, not only because we'll be shortly discussing elections and the campaign for 2002 for 22, but basically because I don't see this big intention of the government. When we take the rhetoric of some important ministers, what they want is more fiscal stimuli and public spending, and this pressure to flexibilize the spending cap. So I think that the risks coming from the fiscal side, they are increasing. Let's see what's going to be the picture of the budget for next year. We will have this information during August. So I think that when we consider that we have lots of transitory public policies that are supporting growth, but it's transitory, when we consider growing risks in the fiscal side, so I think there are reasons for concerns regarding the economic outlook. And we need to remember that probably the growth potential in Brazil, probably, I think it has shrunk due to this crisis. Investment rate decreasing. We have, as it was not enough, we know that unemployment rate will continue to rise, although it's low compared to peer countries, but we know that the trend, unfortunately, is positive, as a upward trend. We know that companies will be struggling with difficult financial conditions and no performing loans. And so when we see, for example, judging by our experience, how difficult it was to the companies to digest all the recession, the recession during 15 and 16. So it was a prolonged period for the companies, to reduce, to deleverage, to reduce unperforming loans. It was, it was really difficult. We need to remember that GDP by the end of last year was still 3% below the peak before the recession of 2015. So we're talking about a country that has a lower growth potential. We're talking about a country that has lots of wants, and it's not going to be easy to deal with all these risks regarding the fiscal policy, especially considering that if on one hand it's a pragmatic government, so I don't believe that they will just give up of any adjustment at all. I don't see it this way. It's a pragmatic government. It's not like Dilma. Bolsonaro is pretty much different from Dilma, but on the other hand, I don't see ambitious agenda. We don't have clarity of what is exactly the plans of even the finance, the economy minister. So I don't see Paulo Guedes, delivering what his views on a structured agenda for reforms. Even there's a tax reform, I'm skeptical on that. I think that Paulo Guedes, he lost the opportunity to move forward with that proposal from the lower house, which is a good proposal. I think the government lost this opportunity, and I think that this proposal that they just have sent to Congress, I think is even that one that is shy, but I think that there will be lots of opposition to this reform, especially from services, because tax burden for some sectors, it will be increased. So I think that okay, I think extreme scenarios, I think it's unlikely. As I said, I think it's a pragmatic government with some base in Congress. But on the other hand, I see a mediocre scenario for Brazil going forward.
Anyway, let me thank Zaina very much for her words. Obviously, we have a contrasting points of view, which is good. But I think that the point that Zaina makes, that so much of aggregate demand today is being kept up by a very expansionist fiscal policy, perhaps adequate. I think that I would support the kind of fiscal policy that's going on right now. But obviously this creates a very dicey picture for what could happen in 2021. And I think that's very much on the minds of investors. So it's really a great pleasure to have with us Drauzio.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Paulo. Thank you, Chamber. It's a pleasure to be with distinguished speakers. I will put two hats, my economist hat and the market strategist hat here. So we start with the economist one and how to structure this. My main concern really is not what happens in 2020 and beyond, is what may not happen. And I think Zaina and Fernando touched on those with different views, but it's not just a passing fad. This structural shock is an important shock, and there are several shocks. So it has to be dealt with as a structural transformation that needs also structural responses. But shorter term, let's break it down into shorter term. I think it's mostly set in the short term. You see, you can follow mobility data domestically or Google. There is a strong recovery happening from very depressed levels. So we'll probably see better growth numbers than the ones now in consensus, and it's happening. That's good. But you have to remember where you're coming from and what happened, what has happened. There's discussion about VU. I think it is not relevant, really. It's, to me, the most relevant part is where you end. And I think that's where rating agencies will be looking at what's a sustainable growth more than dead stocks, but we have Lisa to talk more intelligently about that. So remember where you're coming from. External shock is still with us, China, US, it's persistent. There is the institutional side of it. We are getting closer to impeachment, not really because we need the judges to talk. There's an investigation going on, but there's institutional shock that seems to be persistent as well. And on top of that, you have a health shock. We may get a vaccine 6 months to 1 year from now. Doesn't look like it will be 100% effective, so it may be a persistent shock. We are trying to find out, but chances are that there is some persistence in this shock as well. And the productivity shock is a supply demand, but is also a lasting productivity shock. We have to do things in a different way going forward. So we have a couple of supply shocks, demand shock, domestic and external. And you're coming from 2%, 2.5% growth rate. So to me, the most relevant is where you end up at 2, 2.5. Chances are that you may end up at on the low end of this range or below, because those shocks are persistent. So unless you move. So that's the thing. For the short term, I would say the central bank has a lot of leeway. Rates will be low, accommodation prevails. We will see a recovery, but going forward in the longer term, I think that's the most important question here. And it depends on the responses to these crises. There's not only one. And when I was writing down this notes, I say, well, they always start with R, and here they are. Relief. We talk about fiscal stimulus, not really stimulus, is relief. It's different, can be more powerful, but say, just an example, cab driver doesn't get money credit to fix car. His driving goes to zero. If you give them some money, he will probably drive not as much as he was driving before, but there will be a big jump from the zero. So relief can be very powerful. That's the first thing to keep in mind. So it's not going to have the multiplication effect of a typical stimulus policy. That's another thing to keep in mind. When you come out of that, you don't come out of that at a higher level than you were before. You come out of that with a lot of that, but versus the other scenario of zero, of course, it's very important. So I think the relief measures are very important. I think it's a good thing. Brazil was very strong. I'm more concerned about Mexico, which is weak on that side. So I think that's important. Recessions for gun output is oftentimes done for good, so it's important to do that. I think Brazil did well. So at some point it became a competition who spends more taxpayers' money to do good in Congress. But no, it's first R I think was okay, not stellar, but okay. I think it can be more targeted. The second one, I think you had to be, and it has to start soon. You have to be ready to start to restructure some companies, businesses. The world has changed, not the domestic debt, but it's now you have to deal with that. We may have another 2002 moment. I'll get back to that later. So you have to be ready to, again, reconstruct, restructure the R's you want to pick. And that's important so that you don't create or sustain zombies and do like a Japanese samba, this type of policies. You get used to relief and as a way of living, and that's not it. At some point, you have to see some destruction and reconstruction. The third R to me is, as has been touched on here, and I want to talk more about that, is reform. It's a structural shock. If you don't reform, tax reform, Brazil is probably one of the worst tax systems in the world, not the worst. Social policy, Brazil transfers 25%, and before and after transfers, the Gini coefficient doesn't change much. It's one of the worst or the lowest changes in Gini, given the transfers that happen that are comparable to rich European countries, by the way, what's spent on social policy. So that's very important. And also, of course, the second item in spending, which is payroll. So it's important to propose. The government started in a timid path and late. That's why we were bearish Brazil started last year before this crisis, but they have to move from. The last R is a re-election. If you keep focusing on re-election and forget about the other three R's, I think none of them will come to effect. So that's what made us negative last year, and we are seeing much more moderate phase of our administration. It's important that they have a longer term view and they try to stay away from the short termism, this re-election focus. So what that means, now moving, changing hats here to markets, what does that mean? As I said, short term, I think a lot is set, but the longer term makes it binary. So on the, let me go quickly by markets. Rates, short term, yes. Can rates be low for long? Yes, they can in the world, and it's happening. Inflation is low. In principle, discussion, which I think is a bit confusing. Can we bring rates to low, or you could bring it to -5? I think it wouldn't matter much for inflation. That should you do it? Well, there's a priority. There's a first objective, which is inflation, but there are other objectives of monetary policy as well. So it's not never like a one priority and period, right? So of course you could bring it lower, but there are allocational implications of bringing rates to low. We just use a simple forward premium framework, and our view and our estimation rates are already below what is sufficient to stabilize external sector. You see that Brazil, in terms of flows, Brazil has posted the worst, the highest and the worst picture in outflows across all EM in the first quarter. So chances are, even if our model is wrong, chances are that you probably undershot. Well, you have several goals. One is to fund the government at lower rates. So there's moral hazard here. You have to be careful. And I think, yeah, you push the frontier. So I think there's not much more to do on the Selic. I think that has been overdone. So yeah, market's pricing a little bit of premium. Yeah, it could benefit, not 15, 20 basis points there, but longer end of the curve, term premium is there for a reason. We think it's still too high. Central banks exhaust the policy rate, they move to QE to tame the long end of the curve. And I think there's more room for that. There's also some confusion on QE. It's not QE, a la EC, a la Fed. I would say probably is closer to QE, a la ECB for Italy. What you want to prevent is much more of a twisting and providing liquidity provision, and that markets stay functional so that you move Brazil's equilibrium out of the bad equilibrium. There are multiple equilibriums, so you want to avoid the fire sale. You want to provide exit for some investors. You want to keep volatility low so that you don't validate the worst equilibrium. I think that's much more QE than monetization of debt and funding the government. And it's not, when people talk about, well, the domestic debt, they'll never default on that because they can always monetize that with QE. It's not the point. That's not the point of QE. Again, it's to secure, to anchor the better equilibrium. So I think it's a good thing if used properly. I think the central bank will use it properly and should anchor the long end of the curve. It should actually flatten the long end of the curve. You cannot monetize the debt, you generate hyperinflation. You cannot, it's just exchanging 6 for half a dozen in the balance sheet. There's reserves for debt. So it's not really what people have in mind. You can hyperinflate without QE. Brazil has managed to do that. So let's see it as more of a twist and an anchoring of a flatter curve. And therefore, I think it's there's still some room there. People say, well, it's term premium is there for a reason because there are fiscal risks. Yeah, I think people know that. To me, it's a matter of consistency. If there is a risk, perceived risk of monetization that's higher than the markets perceive and the term premium. So you should see also much higher inflation break-evens. You should see much higher credit spreads. That's not what you're seeing. So that's why I think the term premium, the local curve stands out versus break-evens, inflation break-evens, and credit. Having said all that, yes, it becomes binary for the structural reasons that I mentioned, structural nature of those shocks. And this binary risk, I think, is best expressed via FX. Dollar weakness is helping lower volatility. I think we got to a range here in global markets. Lower volatility makes your EM propositions a whole better because lower vol, better for riskier assets. And therefore, and with a weaker dollar, you're seeing some appreciation of BRL. But I think it will remain with the validation, with the consent of the central bank, the proxy hedge for Brazil risks, for global risks, and therefore is going to be the best expression of those binary risks. And I think you have to combine your more constructive short-term views with more cautious longer-term views on FX, depending on how the government manages on the 3 remaining R's that I mentioned. And let me stop here.
Thank Drauzio very much. I think that he's spot on with all of these, but primarily it is this binary risk that investors are looking, and that has been pointed out repeatedly. And obviously, if you see signs that the fiscal anchor is slipping because of abandoning the ceiling law, then you have the outcome that nobody wants. On the other hand, if you don't continue with the fiscal programs, it's likely that you're going to have a very difficult situation with aggregate demand in 2021, and then the economy is going to begin to slip severely. So clearly, very difficult issues in the short run, and a lot of that really depends on the outlook on the structural reforms, and when could Brazil, if ever, in the near term, within, let's say, the next 5 years, regain the investment grade, which would give everyone more confidence in the medium-term outlook. So we are very privileged to have Lisa Chinello with us, and I will now give the floor to Lisa.
A pleasure. Thank you so much, John, Paolo, the Chamber. It's always great to be with the Chamber, and it's also then even more enjoyable to be with such a fantastic set of co-panelists and hear the comments. I'll start with the rating, kind of what action we recently took so far amid COVID, and then we can think about how those challenges to get back to investment grade. I'm just going to share my screen for a moment to show you where. Can you see the screen? Can you see the ratings in Latin America or no? Yes.
Yeah, we can see them.
Fantastic. So, except you there. So, across the LATAM, we have 28 ratings. 17 are in the spec grade. Brazil is among that group since 2015. We have 12 negative. Brazil is not among that group. We have, since March, and this is what I want to highlight, amid COVID, the global shock, the oil price shock, we have looked at practically all of our ratings globally, but we're almost there in the 130 global ratings, but we've looked at all of them in LATAM and the Caribbean. And we've had 17 changes, or more than that if we consider the various actions on Argentina and Ecuador, et cetera. But within that context, in March, we revised the outlook on Brazil from positive, which we had just placed in December, to stable. I think that's the point I wanted to highlight. So it was a negative rating action in the context of the COVID landscape, the new dynamic globally. Not all ratings changed, and but the positive trends that we saw on Brazil have stalled, or we expected they would stall with the risks of that, and hence the revision of the outlook to stable. And I think from the comments you've heard thus far from Fernando, from Zaina and Drowsy, you can feel that it's a more balanced discussion with the risks. There's some prospects of a reform agenda, but then there's these risks if not, et cetera. And when we were sitting back in December, we really saw that there was a greater chance that post-passage of the Social Security reform, and then the question of what was coming next in terms of a tax reform or administrative reform, and then whether you would have this panorama then boosting the growth story slowly playing out, the sense you could get into a more virtuous cycle. With COVID, the exacerbated hit to growth in the near term and the fiscal dynamics, and then how that would play into the political dynamics, would the reform momentum keep going? Question mark, is why we felt we reverted the outlook to stable. And these are the same, then the questions that remain on the table in the near term for the rating really center around the growth story, the fiscal story. Those feed into the very long-term trajectory on the sovereign ratings as well, as we're sitting at BB- with a stable outlook. On the growth side, that is one of the, and I should, stepping back, there are 5 key factors that inform the rating, that build the rating. It's not just the debt to GDP number. And I think, I forget if it was Fernando, Zaino, or Drauzio highlighted, but that we also are going to be looking beyond 2020. 2020 is a bad year for everybody. In some cases, the inherent weaknesses were so strong that we had to downgrade or we put a negative outlook, okay, on a rating. But it's really more than just is there a capacity to take a hit this year, and what will be the policy response moving forward? There's no doubt Brazil has more limited fiscal space than peers in the investment grade category. But the rating is already at BB-, and the fiscal story already significantly weighs on the rating. And it was the prospect that it could improve is why we had the positive outlook. But the growth piece is the other key weakness in the rating that comes together with the fiscal. But it's not, again, so it's not just the fiscal. And then the other factors that inform the rating, the institutional framework, the monetary policy framework, and the external position, those are comparatively speaking more supports than these salient weaknesses on the fiscal and the growth side. And on the growth side, if I step back and I look at our rating actions that we've taken over the last several years, we're still talking about an elusive pickup to an average growth of the 2.5% over the forecast horizon. We still keep missing that. If I go back to the forecast several years ago, we didn't have it. Well, I should say we had that forecast, we've never attained it. Certainly in this pandemic, it's an even greater risk. As we've talked about, we've sequentially downgraded our rating. Question Fernando's highlighting, we might be downgraded the growth story, from a slight contraction to a deeper contraction. We're at a -7 right now, could go the other way depending how things play out. But we still have a comparatively weak recovery. And I think that's the point that I would also want to highlight. And I'll share a screen also very briefly here, that Brazil, from our point of view, is one of the weakest in terms of the growth path moving forward as well. The LATAM stands out globally. Here we compare it with the world and emerging markets. So the red line, LATAM is the weakest. And among that, we see the hit coming this year. But even over the forecast horizon, all of LATAM has some permanent income losses. They're below their pre-COVID level. But Brazil is among the poorer of those. It's below the average. We still see Brazil at the end of 2023, some almost 7 percentage points below pre-COVID. So I think that's a point to highlight. And can you revert that? And I think as was also discussed, the government cannot, in terms of government investment, you really need to turn to the private sector. So the question is, how will the reform agenda pick up in terms of tackling some of these issues? And I think one of the things that, there is an expansive agenda, at least on the table, in terms of concessions, privatizations, BC hashtag agenda, a trade liberalization agenda, you pass a sanitation law, what may happen further down the road with other reforms that are on the table, bankruptcy reform, etc. But central bank autonomy. But will these really play out? I think that's the question. And can that facilitate stronger private investment dynamic to help turn the growth story? Because agreeing with Zaina, you have a lot of relief that is supporting the growth dynamic at the moment. I think one of the things we saw as in terms of a policy misstep is post the global financial crisis. In some sense, the policy stimulus was left in too long, and then that created the quasi-fiscal piece under the Rousseff administration. That led to its own further negative dynamics on the fiscal, which then feed into the negative growth story. So the question is, can you revert this very low level of investment, the very closeness of the economy? That's key in terms of policy steps in the near term to help what we see as quote unquote below average growth relative to its peers in Brazil, a key rating weakness. And you're not going to turn the fiscal story, which is the other key weakness, unless you get growth as well. The two will need to come together. So we can turn to the fiscal, which has clearly worsened when we're thinking about the kind of hit this year in terms of the size of the primary deficit, overall deficit of 15 percentage point of GDP, debt that's getting closer, the way we look at it in net terms, high 70s, mid 90s, what have you. But the question is, can you stabilize and bring that down slowly, the growth piece? But then what's going to happen on all the composition of the fiscal accounts, which are extremely rigid? This is a long-standing weakness on Brazil's fiscal structure, and you tackle Social Security. However, it's still that Social Security is still a very high portion of overall spending, as is payroll. So you still have a lot of rigidities and a lot more, you have a lot of constraints that make it difficult to highlight the challenges of meeting the spending cap, et cetera, over the coming years. And hence the question of additional administrative reform or not. The payroll, how are you going to tackle payroll? Maybe there's some freezing of that, but what happens longer term? A very generous payroll system in Brazil. Local governments. From our metric, local governments are included in our debt metric. We look at net general government debt. So it's not as if it's a risk that you're going to be bailing out local governments and that's going to pop into the debt stock. It's already there, right? That's a criteria approach, but it's also the case that the states were already formally bailed out in the late 90s. That said, there's a lot of challenges in that structure. The pension systems at the local government level, the delivery of education and health at the local level, et cetera. And yes, you had a coming together of the administration in May with putting together a package of relief for some of the states, to manage the COVID shock, so to speak, but the structural issues are still very much there. And the system doesn't, with the fiscal responsibility law and the state debt renegotiation agreements, hasn't generated a permanent solution to that. How do you correct the missteps of policy implementation at the local level? That is still on the table. So that's another important pressure. I would say on the fiscal side, one of the strengths within the fiscal accounts, I would say, is still the composition of the government debt. The fact that it's in reais, and it's generally held by locals. That helps mitigate, from our point of view, some of the important weaknesses in the fiscal stance. But that is the other key piece. The growth and the fiscal and reverting those trajectories, that's the path to investment grade. On the institutional side, and Drowsy, I think, highlighted that a bit, our last downgrade in 2018 weakened that assessment, okay? And that reflected a sluggish policy response to the very pronounced fiscal slippage. There's at times, a lot of noise in the Brazilian political system, but we do believe there are important checks and balances in place. I think you've continued to see that. And that's something I would highlight. You had a lot of noise when you think of what the impeachment processes, including under the Temer administration, and you do have checks and balances weighing in at the end of the day within this, that will hold, in our view, hold the institutional assessment from slipping further, where there's greater signs of social conflict, et cetera. However, if you can pass policies to help revert the fiscal and the growth story, that is the way also you can think of the lifting the institutional side. As I conclude, the external and the monetary policy setting, well, those are comparative strengths in the rating. They hold the rating up as high as it is, so to speak, at BB-. Is there prospects for improvement there if you move ahead with central bank autonomy and formal autonomy and establish a track record? Yes, but that's likely to take a bit more time. Let me stop there, Paolo, with the final comment that in general, the regaining investment grade, will all depend on the pace and commitment of legislation, et cetera. But it's generally, it can be a longer term path, longer time path. Uruguay, Colombia took 10 years to kind of regain, right? So just put that out there, but it all depends on initiatives and proactive policy commitment.
Our next speaker is Tiago Aragão from ARCO Advice, who will give us an inkling into what's going on with the politics of the situation. Tiago?
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all and to hear all the amazing expositions from everyone. Well, the most complex part of all is to talk about the political environment in Brazil. And the political environment in Brazil is always a bit chaotic, a bit messy, but I agree with what Lisa said, that although chaotic, everything in Brazil, chaos occurs within boundaries of institutionality, which is very different from the type of political chaos that we see in other Latin American countries. because what we see is a problem of quality of individuals, of interaction of individuals, of capabilities, of convergences, of exaggeration in divergences, but we do not see attempts to destabilize another area through taking away power from one particular institutional group to another. So there is not a continuous attempt to change the rules or the institutional frameworks in order to increase power in one end and decrease power in another end. However, we do see narratives that could indicate this desire, but still narratives to actionable actions by members of the government or members of the one of the institutional powers. We are not seeing this yet. So at the end of the day, the main problem of this administration here, and I was listening to the expositions of Lisa, of Zeina, of Fernando, of Drauzio, and uncertainty is the number one word when you look at Brazil, and frustration is the second word when you look in Brazil. And uncertainty and frustration, they're basically assurances that must be given by the political environment in order for the rest of the environment to be able to function. The characteristic of this administration is a characteristic that has a lot of difficulty in seeking articulation or seeking convergence. And why that? Because each ministry or each block of ministries in this particular administration functions as an island that has its independent behaviors, its independent strategies towards the Congress, its independent strategies towards the press, towards the opinion makers, the decision makers, etc. And instead of having a presidential palace that is the focal point of articulation, of integration and narrative, you have a presidential palace that it's the focal point of counterattacks whenever one of these islands are under attack. So the main element and the main strength of the presidential palace during the administration is basically counterattacking any attacks that comes from society, from the Congress, or from the press towards the ministries. So the ministries, they have a lot of difficulties in engaging support within the government itself. And because of that, we have a profound lack of balance or equilibrium in the quality of the government, because each one is basically acting on their own. So when we look at the Ministry of Economy, for example, we have a kingdom that was created for Paulo Guedes, perhaps a too large of a kingdom, which is hard to manage, hard to integrate budget, the Ministry of Economy, the state-owned banks, etc. But Paulo Guedes understood since the beginning that he could not have the presidential palace or the Ministry of the Civil House as the focal point to be the bridge between the policies from the Ministry of Economy towards the Congress. This explains in part why he brought, for example, Marcelo Guaranis to the government, and why he had other individuals that could help him emulate what the Ministry of the Civil House used to do in order to anticipate this and depend less on the presidential palace and more within his own structure. But when we look at other areas of the government, we see this lacking. We see the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for example, completely with no bridges between themselves and the Congress. We see the Ministry of Agriculture completely dependent on the Agro Caucus. But so they make a direct transition from the Ministry of Agriculture to the caucus in the Congress without going through the presidential palace. And so at the end of the day, the lack of, I don't want to use the word importance, but the lack of strategic positioning of the presidential palace in order to assure that the policies of the government, they function as a block, they bring back uncertainty and frustration when we evaluate the agenda and the economic agenda that the government wants to push forward. Right now, what we have, because popularity is one of the key, if not the most important driver for a politician, Bolsonaro, he felt over this past week the benefits of the social programs, of the distribution of the social benefits and his popularity rate. So when he understands that the benefit of that came to his popularity rate, which saw a mild growth, he understands a cause and effect that goes beyond what the Ministry of Economy can deliver. And this is a potential point of divergence within the presidential administration, within the government, because Bolsonaro, he is in between two worlds. He is in between the world of the centrist allies in the Congress, which has the verve and the DNA of expenditure, and he is between the world of stability and austerity from the Ministry of Economy, which basically has a opposite position in relation to the allied base in the Congress. So basically this situation puts Bolsonaro in a potential collision route with one side or the other, because as the situation in Brazil becomes more complicated, it will become harder for him to manage popularity, allied base, and economic austerity, everything within the same package, because they are naturally divergent in several issues. So the political environment in Brazil will deteriorate if any of the following happens. So if the popularity of the president drops, this will lead to an instability in the allied base. Why? Because the allied base controls the level of loyalty towards the president based on the level of popularity that the president has, because that's how they identify a transition of popularity from the president to themselves via support. So a drop in popularity leads to instability in the allied base, which then leads to a further instability in the maintenance of the president in his position. An increase in spending from the government generates instability with the economic team, as long as the pressure for the increase in spending comes from the political world towards the economic world. So this is another problem that could put him in between 2 points of instability, dropping popularity with his allied base, pressuring the economic team for increasing expenditure with the economic team, a no stimulus package or no package of social benefits after the pandemic soothes down, for example, beginning 2021, might also bring instability in his popularity. And bringing instability in his popularity leads to the first point of bringing stability to the allied base. And increasing the investigations against the president or his family also leads to instability in popularity, which therefore leads to instability in the allied base. So there are 4 major elements that we have to observe, which are popularity, spending, no stimulus or no social benefits, and investigations. These are 4 elements that they can put Bolsonaro in from one side to another, and having to face the difficulties of the negotiations and the difficulties in managing 2 divergent points of view, which is the Ministry of Economy and part of the allied base that he has formed inside the government, inside the Congress. Just a final point in relation to the Congress. When Bolsonaro created or reinvented the allied base with the centrist parties, the goal there were several goals for him to do that. one of the first goals was to try to reorganize the rating or the speed of approval of matters of interest to the government, which depended less and less from the economic team. So he understood in 2019 that the majority of the measures that came from the Ministry of Economy were being met with better articulation inside the Congress, with increased chances of being approved, while matters that came from the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, and many others were facing difficulties inside the Brazilian Congress. So when he decided to bring the centrist parties on board, he was looking at creating an equilibrium in the approval of matters beyond the Ministry of Economy, in disengaging part of the centrist parties from the Speaker of the House, Rodrigo Maia, which he understood was controlling part of the agenda in a way that he could not intervene into that. And as the investigations advanced, also creating a barrier against an impeachment procedure that could come against him by having an expanded allied support inside the Congress. However, the centrist parties, they might be relatively unified in negotiating positions with the government, but they are highly individualized in delivering inside the Congress. So the level of loyalty from the centrist parties is not as high as the government tends to believe. So the expectation for betrayals has to be put into the calculation of the government, and we have seen that within in the vetoes of the issues that came in the Congress over the past weeks.
Why I see that scenario so challenging, but I'm not so sure if it's binary, because we are not talking about one reform or another. It's different from the discussion about pension reform. There is no silver bullet now. Even when you talk, for example, about the administrative reform, it's not going to have short-term or medium-term impact. An administrative reform, in order to have short to medium-term impact, we need to challenge acquired rights in Brazil. Otherwise, this is something for the long run. And I'm pretty much convinced that the judiciary would never accept any change in acquired rights in Brazil, for example. So, okay, administrative reform is really important, but given that I don't see benefits in the short run, I think that Bolsonaro will not be enthusiastic of this reform. One reform that could help in the short run is that emergency constitutional amendment. That so far they are saying that, well, what is discussed in this proposal of constitutional amendment is to flexibilize the payroll in the government. Judging from what has been said so far, is that they would like to postpone for now. So what I see from the fiscal side is that there is no silver bullet. Most of the reforms, they do not have impact in the short run. And there is this big appeal for more spending. Tiago has just reinforced my point that there are divisions inside the government. And I see Paulo Guedes pretty much isolated in defending the fiscal reform. And as I said, sorry for repeating that point, but I think it's important, is that the debate among economists, it's not helping at all, because it has implications in the Congress. So part of the Congress thinks that, well, it's okay not eliminating the spending cap, but flexibilizing in order to allow the government to increase investments, for example, public investments, which I think is a mistake, but there is this debate in Brazil. So I think that from this perspective, in order to have, more a structured view in the government or by the president, he has the final word after all. I think we'll need to see things worsening. I don't see now this desire, this willingness from Bolsonaro. And I don't see, as I said, a structural plan from Paulo Guedes. Not so far.
At the end of the day, I don't believe that the spending cap will change, or the spending cap will be flexibilized by the Congress. I understand that this discussion is already complicated for us to observe. It's already a discussion that brings some fears, but I still see that this discussion is located within specific groups inside the Congress with limited powers to advance that. And it all depends at the end of the day, as I was mentioning, on the government's capability to use those things as an opportunity. Because if there is a pressure from specific groups inside the Congress, even from the allied base, to flexibilize the spending cap, the response of the government should be to pressure for a better strategy to accelerate privatizations, because you have to find a way to compensate the desire of one thing with the deliverable of something else. And this is part of the role of the articulation. So if the government wants, or if part of the allied base wants to increase the time frame of the social benefits from the government beyond the pandemic, also the response should be from the government a better articulation, even in, if necessary, creating a new tax for electronic commerce and as a countermeasure to take away some taxes from the payroll for larger companies. The thing is that everything needs a communication and a compensation mechanism that we do not see it happening right now. The main problem at the overall in the administration is the lack of strategy, and the lack of strategy is what generates all sorts of fears that we have in the government. We have necessities in infrastructure that the trust level that the government can deliver those increments and these developments in infrastructure is very low. We have 14,000 projects in infrastructures in Brazil that began and were never finalized. It's almost 140 billion reais, which are paralyzed of infrastructure projects in Brazil that began and never finished. So what is the trust that by increasing the spending cap to allow the government to execute infrastructure projects in Brazil, what sort of message this is giving? Because the government cannot either increase the spending cap nor develop and deliver efficiently infrastructure projects in Brazil. So the problem is in the dual side of it. What I believe is that the main problem that we're going to keep on seeing in this administration are the encapsulated crisis inside the crisis. So it's a government that is prolific in generating crisis. We're going to see this happening, most of them of political nature. As long as the crises are focused on the political nature and the president's popularity maintains stable between 25 to a little bit more, including the neutrals, he will not interfere into the economic world and the economic policies of Paulo Guedes. What will lead him to interfere in this area, and this is where the real danger for Brazil occurs, is if the crises are derived from an economic difficulty that the country is going, and this is directly affecting popularity. So the political chaos in Brazil is bad, but it's not bad because it will cause deterioration. It is bad because it won't lead to improvement. But what will cause deterioration is when the political crisis moves into the economic world and then creates a type of clash that we have not seen yet, which is the type of clash that could put Guedes and Bolsonaro against each other and Guedes eventually leaving the government. And then we could have a change of mindset, because if Guedes eventually leaves the government, the pressure from part of the allied base will be for someone with a more open-minded towards spending. And this is where the problems would begin. So I think that the key drivers for us to observe are the origins of the crisis and the limits in which the crisis can take us somewhere. Of course, if there's a major investigation or a major discovery today, tomorrow, of a corruption scandal, this will increase the dependency of the president on the allied base, therefore generating an inflation in the support of the allied base back to the president. So the more a president depends on the allied base to survive, the higher the costs of this loyalty become. And part of the loyalty or part of the desires of any allied base in Brazil is to occupy positions in the government that has budget, because this is how you can also improve your political capital by occupying this position. So we also have to observe the connectivity between corruption scandals affecting the president, the way that the Supreme Court is looking at that, the way that population reacts, therefore how the allied base will evaluate supporting or not, and what will be the cost of this support. And if the cost of this support will be further positions in the government related to increasing expenditures in the government. So there's a domino effect there that we must observe.
This is a question for Lisa, mainly. Everyone talked about the fiscal side here, but nobody talked about the external accounts. We got the external accounts today, and we see that foreign debt has fallen quite a bit more than reserves have fallen. In fact, reserves rose in June from May to 346 billion, and foreign debt fell to 309 billion. So you still have a situation where, and that's total foreign debt, not government foreign debt. You still have a situation where the reserve assets of the central bank are higher than the totality of gross foreign debt. Maybe a comment on the external side?
I think on the external side, that is a key thing that holds the rating, given the fiscal weaknesses, the growth weaknesses, as high as it is, so to speak. That is the comparative strength from our point of view. We have Brazil that's been kind of right on this net creditor position. We will also include non-res holdings in the local market in our calculation of debt, which sometimes can tilt it over a little bit different than the numbers that you possibly quoted, John. I'm not sure that if I have to relook at the press release to see the breakdown. But bottom line is, despite the fall in reserves, we've also seen the external, we've seen that pattern this year. And we actually have a forward-looking kind of conservative forecast on the external side because of just the concerns in the global dynamics as well. And we also include in our analysis the risk of a market deterioration on Brazil because of notwithstanding the low creditor, the favorable credit position from the point of view of debt, there is a very large external liability if you bring in FDI. So that informs our analysis as well. But there's no question that is an anchor for the rating. And if we were to see continued very solid performance over time, that could even be even more of a support for the rating. And that's a huge difference with the ratings, and I forget who highlighted it, we don't expect a BOP crisis, right? The ratings that you talk about in the single B category, et cetera, there you also have a significant external weakness. You don't in Brazil. And if you compare Brazil's BB- rating back at the beginning of the 2000s with where it is today, very different external picture. You had a significant external vulnerability. that weighed on and even more than offset, kind of, further exacerbated the fiscal story. And that is why there's as much, quote unquote, stability that you have in Brazil at the moment, because you don't have that weakness. And that's a key, difference with, say, in Argentina, right, that has kind of moved more rapidly down into the default or rating trajectory, because it also has the pronounced external weakness. Brazil does not.
About that, but had to start from the beginning. I don't think it's good for Bolsonaro. Organized crime is a parallel government, and it reflects the inability of the actual government to do its job. That's why you have a parallel organization, and Bolsonaro will only benefit from that if he could manage to better use the social spending, better use the resource in the government, reforming the government to spend more properly on the safety of the population and preventing, on transferring resources better and preventing crime with more education, better social policies. So I think that will benefit Bolsonaro if he managed to improve the structure of the state and deliver better services. That's not happening. We hope it happens, but it has not happened. So to pose as a sheriff doesn't give you sustained credibility. So I think that doesn't happen. Mexicanization, I think there's a risk, but again, I had to compare how strong the states are in Brazil and Mexico. I think Brazilian institutions somehow, on police, military, and the resources the federal government has managed to deploy have been a lot stronger than in Mexico. So that's another thing to keep in mind. So yes, if we go through another round of deterioration of the state, yeah, we could get there, but I think we're far. The other thing to keep in mind, there are several studies on that. I don't know the exact cost on them, has been estimated. Of course, very costly, tens of billions of dollars, but it's important to understand the organization of crime. You talk to Mexicans, they say, well, I miss those days when crime was actually organized. Now it's so disorganized. So when you have competition in crime, you end up with a very violent equilibrium.
Thank you, Paulo, and thank you to all the panelists for an excellent discussion. And once again, thanks to Bradesco for sponsorship. Before I close, I wanted to remind attendees that on Thursday, the 30th of July, we will host a webinar on the new legal framework for water and sewage services, sanitation, in Brazil at 10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time and 11 a.m. Brazilian time. We hope to see you then, and certainly that's pertinent to this discussion today. In the meantime, stay healthy and safe, and thank you again.